Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Thank you all for joining this last technical session of the week, and thank you for staying with us throughout the week for the Global Forum for Responsible Recruitment. My name is Kendra Reines, and I'm the Chief of Mission for the International Organization for Migration, the UN Migration Agency here in Malaysia, and I'll be moderating this panel today. So first off, if you would like to listen to a different language, first click the globe icon on the right, select your language, and then mute the video player. In this session, we'll speak to several senior executives to examine multi-stakeholder efforts to enhance protection of migrant workers throughout the different tiers of the supply chain. They will discuss best practices for setting high standards, monitoring, and ensuring compliance throughout various stages of activity in an industry, while engaging with a variety of stakeholders. It's not an easy, but it's a very important task. The speakers will shine a spotlight on the challenges and successes so far, while exploring ways to engage in new and challenging contexts. This is an excellent section to end on, as experts will speak directly about successes and solutions. I personally prefer to focus on solutions rather than just problems, so I'm very excited to end with this great panel today that will give us concrete ideas on the way forward to address challenges of compliance from several experts. So to start us off with this session, we'd now like to do a live poll through a word cloud. So the question we have for you is, as we keep migrants at the forefront of our engagements, what does the concept of migrant voice mean in the context of multi-stakeholder initiatives? So please type in and answer in just one or two words what the concept of migrant voice means to you in the context of multi-stakeholder initiatives. Great. So migrant voice, we have including migrants, migrants' rights, needs and priorities, worker committees, empowerment, I like that one, meaningful consultation, extremely important, inclusion and diversity, design participation, enhancing ownership, another great one. Including migrants. Issues are raised. Yes, issues are raised from the ground. Need for support. Great. Thank you everyone for participating in this and for helping to set us off on highlighting some of the key issues that we have. So now I'm pleased to introduce our esteemed panelists. So first I'd like to introduce Sharon Waxman, CEO and President of the Fair Labor Association and a leading voice in foreign affairs. Sharon is an expert in corporate social responsibility and labor rights, working to create sustainable solutions to prevent and remediate labor rights violations in the apparel and agriculture sectors through the combined efforts of leading multinational corporations, public and private universities, and civil society organizations. Sharon has also over 2 decades as a senior official with the US government. Welcome, Sharon. The second panelist will be Rochelle Zaid, Senior Director of Standards and Impacts at Sustainable Accountability International. Rochelle has years of expertise developing tools, evaluation, and monitoring systems, and developing innovative initiatives to advance the human rights of workers around the world. Rochelle has also directly implemented social compliance systems with Eileen Fisher and Country Miss. The next panelist is Rachel Phillips-Rigby, the lead on forced labor at the Rainforest Alliance. Rachel works with stakeholders around the world to spot risks, understand realities, and develop solutions grounded in international standards while being mindful of the local context. Rachel also has 15 years with the United States Department of Labor, developing partnerships with NGOs and foreign governments to address child labor and forced labor. And our last but not least panelist will be Rana Starr, President and CEO of the Association of Professional Social Compliance Auditors, where she leads and supports individuals and organizations performing independent social compliance audits. Rana is an expert in risk management across emerging markets, combining a track record of success in supply chain management, administration, international business coordination, and workplace compliance. Rana has over 21 years with McDonald's, developing their social compliance program. So thank you, panelists, for joining us today, and I look forward to a great session. So to start us off, I'll ask Sharon the first question. So Sharon, from your experience with FLA or elsewhere, what does the concept of migrant rights mean in the context of multi-stakeholder initiatives, and what is being done to mainstream and strengthen migrant rights throughout existing interventions?
Thanks so much, Kendra, for the really thoughtful question. And thanks to you as well for including the Fair Labor Association in this panel discussion. It's really fantastic to be on a panel with so many like-minded leading colleagues across the sector. So I'm really looking forward to not only sharing what my organization does, but to joining the conversation with all of these other like-minded colleagues. Responsible recruitment at the Fair Labor Association has really been a big part of our work for a long time. And so it's really exciting to see that this topic is now the focus of so many international organizations and NGOs and companies. At the FLA, we think about migrant rights as a part of overall worker rights, and our focus is strengthening corporate commitments and actions to respect and protect those rights. So what I'm going to do in my short time here is just walk you through the 3 areas that we focus on as an organization, ending with some of the solutions. So we think about migrant rights and workers' rights in three levels. So first is commitment. And that means sort of the high-level commitment of corporate leaders, CEOs, the senior executive team, and how those commitments are implemented, and then last, how problems are remediated when they do occur. So the first is commitment, and at the FLA, we really look to companies to commit to a very high standard that's rooted in the ILO framework, and then to cascade that commitment through all of their management systems, including things that we're all familiar with, codes of conduct, as I said before, senior executive commitments. Those are often then included in supplier contracts. and an audit tool that is smart and sophisticated and comprehensive enough to ask the right questions so that forced labor for migrants and all others would appear if an auditor is in a factory or on a farm. We have recently joined with the AAFA, the American Apparel and Footwear Association, to try to create an industry-wide approach to tackling this issue. The commitment builds on our own codes and benchmarks for detecting forced labor with migrants. And the goal is to create an industry-wide standard grounded in the employer pay principles. So what that means is that if, in really simple terms, if a recruitment fee is paid by a worker under the employer pays principle, the employer would reimburse the migrant worker. The second area that we focus on is on implementation. And in this kind of bucket, the suppliers and manufacturers are really a huge and critical link in the implementation, since they work directly and bring the workers into the factory or a farm. In a factory, HR and compliance managers really need to be equipped with the knowledge and tools so that they know how to implement the protections in a way that are consistent with international standards as well as local regulations on forced labor. Our approach at the FLA has been to identify countries where migrant workers are especially at high risk and to offer trainings. Before COVID changed everything for all of us, we began focusing on Malaysia and Taiwan, and we targeted suppliers in those countries through a comprehensive responsible recruitment training program for both Tier 1 and Tier 2 suppliers that was focused on the indicators of unfair recruitment practices and the measures that can be taken to protect workers and remediate when problems occur. Our list obviously is longer than Malaysia and Taiwan. We had training planned for Jordan, which is another very high-risk area, and we are going to resume that, inshallah, once COVID requirements allow us to. So the third area that we focus on at the FLA is remediation, and I think this is where it really gets interesting, because companies can have commitments, they can have an implementation strategy, they can have codes and very strong management systems, but ultimately the company needs to be able to solve the problems when they occur. So I have three examples that I want to just run through very quickly. One is in the manufacturing program. In a factory where our assessors were in the Middle East, they found migrant workers from Sri Lanka who were paying agency fees that ranged from $150 to $550 to the Bureau of Employment in Sri Lanka. We found that the migrant workers didn't sign their contracts for 2 days to 2 weeks after they started working in the factory. So the brand worked with the factory on a remediation plan that required the supplier to retroactively pay worker fees and ensure that workers would not pay fees going forward. The plan also required the factory to ensure that workers would be signing employment contracts on their first day, and that all the work forms would be translated into their native language, because the ones that they were given were either in English or Arabic. So this, I think, is a good example of that employer pays principle that we are trying to help embed across the industry with our colleagues at the American Apparel Footwear Association. The second is in our agriculture program. We've been piloting a collaborative remediation project in Turkey. It's called Harvesting the Future. And what we're doing is bringing together 8 of the largest global food and beverage companies, 20 of their Turkey-based suppliers, and the government of Turkey to work with the thousands of seasonal agriculture workers who migrate within Turkey for farm work. So we have mapped 9,000 workers and traced them to 350 labor brokers. And these are workers who migrate from crop to crop. So they'll work on, depending on the season, they'll work on hazelnuts, or sugar beets, cotton, apricots, potato. There's no consistency in the commodity. What really binds these groups of migrant workers together are the labor recruiters. So based on that mapping, we've been able to identify the labor brokers and go in and train them on responsible recruitment and decent work principles. And in the end, we really think this will improve the experience for workers. And we're excited to continue this work. The next phase of it will focus on access to remedy, grievance mechanisms, and fair wage. So with this example, to my mind, is a really great way to think about a multi-stakeholder collaboration aimed at changing the business environment. It's not just a piecemeal remediation. And in this way, we can really avoid a hyper-focus on the workplace and really look at the full life cycle for the worker journey and include the brand suppliers and the localities. And then the last example of remediation is one that we have not started yet, but we have a new partnership with the IOM and the Consumer Goods Forum, where we are going to bring together, in a similar way, 22 global companies and the largest palm suppliers in Malaysia to address forced labor in the palm sector in Malaysia. I think most people are aware that more than 80% of the labor workers in the palm sector are foreign migrant workers. It's a really thorny, big challenge, and we're really excited to get our hands dirty and work with our partners to tackle this very big problem and ultimately improve conditions for migrant workers in the palm sector in Malaysia. So those are my 3 examples embedded in the 3 sort of pronged approach that the FLA takes to migrant workers.
Great. Thank you so much, Sharon. Great. Thank you. I really appreciate you sharing the framework and then those examples. So important to provide companies and employers and recruiters with the tools to meet those international standards. So thank you so much for sharing those examples. And I know myself and my team here in IOM Malaysia, we're really enjoying working with the FLA team on this. I liked how you phrased it, a thorny big problem of the palm oil industry. So good that we're excited all about tackling these challenges together. Thanks so much. Now, Rochelle, from your experience with SAI or elsewhere, what are the existing gaps in awareness and capacity building, assessment and due diligence practices within auditing and certification? And what steps have the audit and certification community taken to address these gaps, improve capacity, protocols, and coverage related to recruitment supply chains?
Thank you, Kendra and IOM, for inviting SAI to this really important discussion, along with my esteemed colleagues. I'm going to talk a little bit about one of our key tools, SA1000 standard, that was developed in 1997 to address human rights within a workplace setting, and it covers the supply chain of that workplace. We have other programs that we work on collectively, but I'm going to talk about the experiences through the SA1000 since that is an audit and certification program. Migrant labor and its inherent risk have always been a relevant aspect of the workforce, and for years, in many countries, the relevant issues were in reference to national or domestic migration, which has many of the same challenges as international migrant workers. But the plight of the migrant worker for both professionals and less skilled laborers have really grown over the years and impacted all the different industries. As a standard setter, it's important for us to always be paying attention to the new issues that arise and become more prevalent, and update our standards and processes in response to that knowledge. As we learn more about the challenges migrant work faces, the more we can see there are certain gaps in our understanding or in our processes. So what I'm going to talk a little bit about are some of the gaps that we see, some of the ways that we've addressed some of those gaps in our program today, and what we look forward to in the future, what we see as some of the ways forward. So I'll take you briefly through each. Fair recruitment, the expectations of fair recruitment go beyond most workplace standards as they exist today. They don't always address all the complexities related to hiring of migrant labor. And the expectations to protect migrant laborers is typically beyond the conditions of employment that we witness at a work site. Many of the issues can take place prior to arrival of the worker and can involve the role of government. So it's not always housed in an audit frame. And also to really do a testing to fair recruitment practices and not just the pay principle. There's not usually enough time in a typical social audit to address that in a comprehensive way to give you the assurance you might want. Also, we know that auditors need specific additional competences to make sure they really do understand the aspects and the potential risks that the migrant worker faces so they can look for those issues during their audit. We've addressed some of this over the years. Since the standard's been around for over 20 years, we've gone through different iterations of the standard and provide ongoing training to auditors, capacity building for those companies who want to comply to the standard, and to brands to expand their knowledge and the complexities that the workers are facing in the field. For our standard, we've expanded two pieces that I think are really relevant here. As you know, risk assessment is a key part of anyone's due diligence. What are the risks an organization faces? Typically, we find that health and safety are the ways companies look at their risks. We've ensured that labor risks are part of that assessment. So the standard covers basic ILO conventions. What are those risks in that company? How do they, and we know that migrant labor is a risk area. So if there are workers and they really rely on migrant labor workers, they have to really consider the potential risks for those workers, how to better manage them and mitigate the risks. But to support that, we've expanded, the standard has always included the role of a worker and the relationship between workers and management in a company, which we find is really critical, that relationship. What we've expanded it to an actual team. We call it a social performance team, where managers and workers collectively, based on the demographics of organization, they come together as a team of both workers and management to manage those risks, understand those risks that they're facing, And that team, if migrant workers are an important factor in a workplace, those migrant workers have to be representative at that team. So they can include what's their perspective of what challenges they face as a migrant worker. Also, we've engaged and gone into the supply chain. Stakeholder engagement and supply chain engagement is really an important part of our program. And we've included due diligence of the practices of labor agencies where they are included. As we know, a lot of organizations outsource the labor component more and more. For our auditors and for the system, we find that audit planning is a really key component. So auditors really have to plan well. They have to understand the organization they're auditing. They have to understand the risks that they might face, the demographics of that organization, so they can plan appropriately what are the potential risks, are there labor agencies they're working with, and make sure the languages and they understand if they're migrant workers so they can have the appropriate team together to address the demographics. Auditor education is really key. You know, the auditors are the ones that we hold to gather all this data for us to look at and understand the challenges. So it's very important for the auditors to really understand the nuances and the issues that migrant workers face, making sure they have safe surroundings during their interviews, going really deeper into the discriminatory issues and forced labor issues around the migrant worker. So those are some of the things that we focus on in our processes. What we are looking forward to is updating our risk assessment to go deeper into recruitment agencies, intermediaries, and labor agencies. But we are, as always, we look at many different aspects. We will be doing a new iteration of the standard, and we'll be expanding this part. But we do spend a lot of time looking at the relationship of discrimination, pay discrimination, working hours, forced labor, as it relates to the migrant worker. In the future, we think it's really important to be able to link to systems like IRIS and responsible recruitment initiatives. How can our standards link with those standards to really expand the responsibility of all those in the chain? And we are looking forward to making sure our standard can really work and there's a clear linkage between those. We also want to increase when we work with brands and companies to understand that we really need to go deeper into the supply chain where many of the risks lie, where tier one may be covered well, but not as much in the lower tiers. As well, we're looking at different industries like a gig economy and others where migrant issues may vary in these different industries that are emerging. So that's my coverage for now. If there's time for another question, let me know.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rochelle. I really appreciate you recognizing that hiring of migrants can be a risk. So you've definitely outlined some great precautions and systems that are needed to put in place. So thank you very much. I'd like to take this time to also remind everyone in the audience, all of our listeners, please take the opportunity now to post your questions for our excellent panelists in the questions tab. And once we start receiving your questions, we can follow up with the panelists to respond. Now, Rachel, from your experience with Rainforest Alliance or elsewhere, what steps are currently being taken within multi-stakeholder initiatives to address risks and gaps in protection for migrant workers? What are the challenges and specific steps being taken to ensure that migrant workers are ethically recruited? Over to you, Rachel.
Rachel, you're muted.
We'll just follow up in a minute.
Are you able to hear me now?
Yes, go ahead, Rachel. Thanks.
Thank you, Kendra. Apologize for that. And thanks so much to IHRB and IOM for the invitation. I'm so pleased to be part of this group of leading organizations and individuals on the panel. So first, a brief introduction to Rainforest Alliance. We are an international nonprofit organization working in more than 60 countries, and we have worked on the front lines of the global sustainability movement for over 30 years. We call ourselves an alliance because of the diverse stakeholders that are vital to achieving our mission. These include all supply chain actors from retailers all the way upstream to agricultural producers and the workers working on farms. We also work closely with large global NGOs and international organizations like the ones on this panel, as well as local grassroots NGOs around the world. Our certification program is one of our flagship programs, maybe our best known, through which we help farmers produce agricultural products sustainably and help traders and retailers achieve their sustainability goals by purchasing certified products. Our certification program covers a variety of crops, with the most significant numbers in coffee, tea, cocoa, and bananas. Our footprint includes, for example, over 10% of global coffee production, 30% of cocoa, 20% of tea, and 45% of internationally traded bananas. There are over 2 million farmers certified under our standards currently, and 1.5 million or more workers on those certified farms. Of course, our definition of sustainability incorporates environmental, economic, and human rights requirements. So when our farms are audited by independent third-party certification bodies, they're looking at all of those criteria. But upholding strong labor standards is the top priority for us, both on those farms as well as in agricultural processing facilities that we also certify. Our newest standard, which we published last year and goes into effect this July, is fully aligned to the International Labor Organization conventions, just like the other groups on this panel. Our new standard does require that the farms who hold RA certificates pay all recruitment fees and costs, not workers. And we use the definition of recruitment fees laid out in the ILO's Fair Recruitment Guidelines. So Kendra mentioned her focus on solutions. And while I believe standards are a big part of the solution, I also believe that training and tools are so important in this space. Our certified farms really need this kind of capacity building support to meet the requirements in the standard. Actually implementing a no recruitment fees policy is challenging, and it does vary from country to country and sector to sector in terms of the best ways to educate, build capacity, and ensure compliance. So tooling is an area where I think sharing and collaboration are absolutely key. For example, one of our collaborations is with the International Cocoa Initiative, ICI. They have established a forced labor working group. The ICI has traditionally been more focused on child labor in cocoa production in West Africa, but increased attention on forced labor has spurred them to expand their scope and dedicate resources to awareness, training, and tools in this area. They recently developed a great template for a contract between workers and labor providers. It's a very visual tool that can be used with individuals with lower literacy, and it's adapted well for the West African context. So we have offered to pilot that and other tools on our certified farms so they can receive feedback. And then likewise, we have drafted a template for a sample contract that farm owners can sign with labor recruiters to document their commitments and their requirements so that they can be enforced. And we shared that back to the working group so that others working in the cocoa sector can use it and give us feedback. So I think that's the kind of sharing that is really needed, so we're not all reinventing the wheel. And incidentally, in drafting that, we drew inspiration from Verité's excellent responsible sourcing toolkit, which I use all the time. Publicly available tools are so vital to ensure that we aren't duplicating our efforts. And of course, the work of protecting migrant workers in agriculture goes far beyond training and tools. In the crops where we work, there are a lot of migrant workers at harvest times. in the millions. For example, Guatemalan workers harvesting coffee in Honduras, people from northern India migrating to southern India to harvest spices, migrants crossing into southern Nigeria to work in cocoa, and Panamanian workers in Costa Rica working on pineapple farms. Those are just a few examples. So our standard has built-in requirements for remediation of cases of abuse when found, of course. It also requires grievance mechanisms that workers can access at the farm level. But in addition to holding farms accountable for the well-being of workers, it's vital to make sure that migrants also have access to protective services in the broader community when needed. And so we build alliances between a wide range of actors: farmers, government officials, local service providers, and others. It's an important part of our work to build these alliances at the local level with government bodies and community-based organizations, and often as part of multi-stakeholder initiatives. So we not only are one, but we collaborate with other ones, such as the Global Coffee Platform, the Sustainable Coffee Challenge, and other sectoral multi-stakeholder initiatives that are working on these issues in the very specific context of a particular crop, which I think is also very helpful. So we believe that certification is a really important component of holistic protection for migrant workers, but it does take a network of actors in collaboration, each doing their part. It will take that to really achieve the goals that we've set for ourselves. Thank you.
So much, Rachel. And again, I really appreciate your reference to developing good tools that have to be part of the solution, and your recognition that indeed ethical recruitment is hard. So thank you for your leadership at Rainforest Alliance to identify good practices and replicate good practices. And I love it. I also fully stand by the idea of not reinventing the wheel and sharing best practices for one another. So thanks for being a leader in that. Now I'd like to move to Rana. So Rana, APSCA is a young organization who, in short, started with the intent to enhance the professional and credibility of social compliance audits. So how has APSCA worked with their members and the industry to define the necessary knowledge to adequately assess and raise issues as it relates to migration, migrant workers, and recruitment?
Great, thanks, Kendra. APSCA is quite a mouthful, isn't it? But it is the Association of Professional Social Compliance Auditors. I think when I first started, it took me quite a while to get my mouth around saying it properly. But just going into the social compliance auditing industry is estimated to be worth over $300 million US. Yet we did not have an association like CPA for accounting and the Bar Association for lawyers to set the standards for social compliance audit firms and auditors until 2015, when APSCA commenced. APSCA was a sixth attempt by the industry to establish a professional organization which includes membership noting clear requirements and expectations for both audit firms and individual auditors. We started with just 9 founding member firms and have grown to 55 as of last month, and more than 4,000 auditors located in 96 different countries. The first year was spent establishing the new organization, which included identifying stakeholder board members, creating 3 separate working groups, each with a supporting consultation group to ensure we are being reflective of the industry as a whole. 2 of these working groups were focused on developing elements which went on to later become our competency framework. This document is available on our website if you wish to see all of the various areas that we cover. I'll talk only about a few elements included in that document as it relates to migrant workers. The first working group was focused on identifying the categories that would be included in the competency framework and which would not. We assessed numerous programs and what was included. However, our intent was never to test auditors to every single element that is included in all social compliance audit programs. We understood that there's some elements that actually shouldn't be included in a social compliance audit, as they're specialist skills, which are generally not held by a social compliance auditor. As an example, structural integrity, where you need to be a professional structural engineer to adequately assess and determine the structural integrity of a building. APSCA have not developed an audit protocol, and there's no intention of people ever conducting an APSCA audit. There are enough great protocols out here. We don't need another one. We've just heard about 3 fantastic ones that are going. APSCA are not competitors to anyone. We're here to work together and realize our vision and our mission, which is to be trusted professionals within the social compliance industry and to enhance the professionalism and credibility of those that are executing those audits. Our second working group was focused on identifying the competencies that would be needed by the auditors to effectively execute an audit. From there, we developed the examination process to test that the auditors actually had those skills. Ultimately, those 2 working groups merged together and they finalized the draft of the competency framework before it went to the executive board, the stakeholder board, and then on to public comment in 2017. The competency framework looks at both foundational skills and functional knowledge areas which are required of an auditor to effectively execute an audit. APSCA's 3-part examination process, which assesses auditors' competencies across multiple areas, ensures we are understanding both the foundational skills and the functional knowledge areas, not just looking at their academic knowledge. APSCA divided the areas that were assessed into the 2 categories. Foundational skills, which are really important to ensure that the functional areas can be adequately assessed. Examples of a foundational skill include strategic and system thinking, observation and investigation, problem solving and analytical decision making, interview skills, just to name a few. Some of the functional knowledge areas are forced labor, discrimination and disciplinary practices, harassment and abuse, wage and benefits, which also include deductions and terms of employment, as well as many, many more. But this includes the auditor's ability to triangulate information that's gathered during an audit, which is so important to that effective execution and thus identifying those issues during an audit. Validating auditors' knowledge within the areas of migrant labor and recruitment are very important elements, and they're contained within all 3 parts of iExam. You can read more about the exam on our website. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Part 3 exam, which is the final exam in the series. It's an oral exam and includes a third-party interviewer. It simulates management and worker interviews and tests the auditor's listening skills, their ability to follow up on subtle information that's provided during the interview process and highlight those warning signs, and also tests their ability to deal with difficult situations, as well as to be able to deal with maybe the shyer type of worker that they're interviewing, which can often be those migrant workers that are unsure about what's happening. A standard social compliance audit is set to identify if there is an existence of warning signs in various categories, including migrant labor. A standard audit, as we heard from Rochelle just a moment ago, doesn't generally have time to do that super deep dive into the individual categories. These warning signs should be included in the report and then followed up during a separate audit, which focuses on those specific areas. It is as important that the recipient of the audit results has a process in place which sees that the reports are all read, and where warning signs are reported, they can implement a deep dive audit into those specific issues. The solution to addressing the issue doesn't lay with just one party. There are multiple groups that need to work together for that larger solution, particularly when we're focused on migrant workers and recruitment. But I'll stop for there now and I'll hand back to you, Kendra. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Rana. Very good to hear how APSCA is formed to bring stakeholders together again and to use the best practices rather than reinventing the wheel. Now I have a follow-up question. So I understand there's been articles criticizing social compliance audits as not being effective. So how does APSCA respond to this?
Yeah, that's a good question. It is a big criticism that we all face, right? But the social audits are effective. But I think where people come down and think that they're not effective is because they see social audits as a standalone solution, and they're not. They can't be. Sites that are being audited need to be held accountable and responsible for following up on the issues that are raised. Develop corrective action plans, but they have to be looking at the root cause. You can't just have a Band-Aid effect. I remember going back to my past life and I'd look at corrective action plans when it came to, say, working hours, and their solution was to hire 50 new workers. I mean, that's probably not going to fix the problem. So making sure they really, truly understand what's causing the issue in the first place, but also ensuring that the buyer or whoever was requesting the audit also need to participate in that time to help close those gaps, following up with the site, holding them accountable. Audit firms, auditors, unless it's specifically organized with them to come back and do the follow-up on corrective actions, it's generally not part of a standard social compliance audit. And I think that's one challenge and one area that we all need to keep in our mind. But each person plays a very important role as part of that bigger picture. But ultimately, we need to make sure that we're holding the site accountable, but also supporting them in what they need. Social compliance audits can help identify those areas of risk. They can identify forced labor, harassment, child labor, discrimination, etc. But we need those deeper dives by somebody who specializes in those areas to work with the firms.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I'd like to go back to Rochelle. Can you talk? We understand that there's been a great deal of discussion globally, and even during this forum, on the concept of a living wage. Can you share SAI's view on a living wage as it relates to migrant workers?
Sure. SAI, it's always been part of our program, the SA 8000 standard, that workers are paid a living wage. And what is a living wage is the biggest question. How do you determine a living wage versus minimum wage? So a little background, as in the past several years, we helped found the Global Living Wage Coalition of standard setters with the anchors. Anchors are experts in this field, came up with how to determine a living wage by location. But, and that's just a little bit background about how important living wage is in the community. Rainforest Alliance is part of that initiative as well, and one of the founding members as well. So it's really an important part. But migrant labor in our system is a respected worker and part of the workforce, therefore is treated in the same way as a national worker, and therefore is awarded the same rights. So a living wage needs to be paid to the migrant worker as well. And there are challenges in making sure that they are paid fairly and they're not discriminated against with lower wages, which can happen in a lot of industries, especially in agriculture. I wanted to highlight one thing, actually. It's a new study, a research paper that the anchors are just releasing in the next coming days. A lot of companies and brands and businesses think that the migrant worker should be paid a lower living wage than a national worker because of where their home country typically costs less, and they send a lot of their money home to their family in their home countries. But the research is based on a lot of data that they've collected and the benchmarks they've collected, and they've done a comparison of the costs for migrant workers versus national workers. And they did this example in Nicaragua and Costa Rica, where a lot of Nicaraguans come to Costa Rica, migrate to Costa Rica. The name of the paper is Same Job, Different Wage for Migrants, Nicaragua Migrants and a Living Wage in Costa Rica. And the comparison is the living wage should be the same. The difference is maybe 5%, not because of the fees that migrant workers have to pay. It's all the other associated. They live in two locations. they send money home, they call home all the time. There's so much activity that they've traced all of this to say that the migrant worker should be paid the same living wage as a regular worker. Now, paying a living wage in itself we know is really difficult. Understanding what the gaps are and how to fill those gaps are very critical, and that's a separate conversation. But for us, a migrant worker is treated in the same way as a national worker and afforded the same rights. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Indeed. Migrant workers are human workers. So, and this is a great segue to our next question, which is directed to Sharon. Sharon, we have a question from the audience from Sheila. Sheila's asking, who should ultimately pay for recruitment fees and related costs? The farmers, suppliers, or the brand's buyers?
That's a really great question. I mean, to us, the first question is, who should not pay those fees? And absolutely, the workers should not pay those fees. Workers should never have to pay for a job. They need to be educated. They need to understand that recruitment fees are not required to obtain a job. We believe that the employer ought to pay, and that is the standard that we are working, as I said in my comments, across the industry with the AAFA to get alignment on as part of a broader effort to drive change. So the employers are responsible for paying recruitment fees.
Great. Thank you so much, Sharon. Now we have a question from Johan in Brussels, and this is directed to Rachel and Rochelle. So how do these private standards align with national regulations in countries of origin? And how do you ensure regulations are improved for all recruiters, irrespective of whether they market for a slight number of brands? So maybe we'll start with Rachel.
Thank you, Johan. So I'll start by saying that in the Rainforest Alliance standard, we do require compliance with all applicable national laws in the country. And if our standards differ from the applicable laws in the country, we require that the higher standard be followed. With respect to standards on labor recruiters, our requirement states that if there is a recruitment registration system in the country, that the recruiter should be a registered one. So our certified farms need to work with recruiters who are registered in whatever the national system is. Now, we know that in many countries, there may not be a system of registration and licensure, or there may be on paper, but it isn't functioning that well. So those are, again, examples of where we work on the ground with the governments in question to try to, encourage the uptake of those types of systems and strengthen each other and be in communication about who are the recruiters working in this space and how can we jointly ensure that they're operating ethically.
Great, thanks so much. Rochelle, do you have anything to add for that?
Yeah, very similar to what Rachel said. So, we follow, of course, our auditors and systems have to really know what the national laws are, and those have to be upheld. But again, many of the standards around the table go beyond the local law, and we exist because of their lapses in adherence to the laws. So very, very similar of what those laws are in that country, and understanding them are really very important. But again, our ideas and principles typically, in many cases, go beyond that. So we have to work with understanding the local laws and trying to, raise the bar as much as we can on that relationship and the responsibilities around recruitment. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much to both of you. I think we have maybe at least time for one more question. So I have a question from Anna to Sharon. So participatory multi-stakeholder initiatives would mean migrant workers are engaged at the design stages of those initiatives and in the ongoing monitoring of how these initiatives deliver results. Can you reflect on that engagement in the terms of your own audit systems, standards, and principles, and how it was ensured that migrant worker participation was meaningful, not tokenistic? So maybe Sharon, you can start, and then I welcome any other panelists if they'd like to add on.
Yeah, it's really, that's a great question, and thank you for asking it. We are a multi-stakeholder initiative of 3 equal parts. One of the parts of our organization is comprised of non-governmental organizations, civil society, and labor unions. So while everyone in the organization is very focused on embedding the sort of core ILO standards throughout their systems, I think it's fair to say that the NGO part of the FLA is the most vocal in raising sort of individual issues and rights questions for migrant workers and for all workers. So, and who are those people? That's Oxfam is a part of that. Part of our organization, Global Fairness Initiative. We have a union from Bangladesh, a workers' rights organization from India. So we have people at the table who can really speak to that voice. And as a multi-stakeholder initiative, when we're developing our standards and benchmarks and KPIs that are based on those ILO standards, those people are at the table. And part of the importance of having them there is to really help us keep that voice and perspective of all workers and migrant workers at the forefront. So they're included as a part of the structure of our organization.
Great. Thank you so much, Sharon. So we're almost out of time. This is great questions, great dialogue. I'd just like to run through if anyone has any last final comments before we close today. I'll start with Rana. Do you have any closing final thoughts?
I think basically this is a joint effort. We all have a role to play towards the elimination of migrant labor and recruitment abuses. But I think we also need to take time to reflect on the large steps that we have achieved, whilst maintaining a focus on what still needs to be reached in order to hit that overall goal of eradication of human rights abuses. Take time to consider the improvements that have been made and continues to be made. We're not there yet, but I gather inspiration from, when I started in the industry in the early 2000s and some of the challenges that we were facing then with child labor. And together as an industry, we continue to work our way at it, and we've seen some dramatic improvements. So us all staying focused on the enhancements to the work lives of the vulnerable, the migrant workers. APSCA is excited to be part of that process and focusing on the enhancement to the social auditing element of it through our examination and continuous professional development process, and working with so many great people, such as those on the panel today, and the many that are supporters of ours, as well as on the stakeholder and our executive boards as well. So thanks very much for the opportunity.
Great, thanks so much, Rana. Rochelle, do you have any final remarks?
And just to add on to what some of the things that Rona just said, many of us have been at this for over 20 years, and to see the evolution is pretty amazing. To have this whole conference and the ongoing commitment to the migrant worker and the plight and the issues they face, that it's in the forefront, that we are all, addressing it and understanding it. as well as when I mentioned the living wage component of it, a conversation that many were afraid to have, and what would a living wage do to our industry? And everybody is talking about it. The fact that there is no fear around it now. Now there are, what are the solutions? How do we address this? How do we fill the gap? How do we as multi-stakeholders look at all the components and what is each of our role to play? And I think it's great to watch the evolution that's happening and the progress that we're making. We have a lot to do, and 20 more years of work to make sure all workers are treated the way they should be at a workplace, no matter where they work, no matter what country. I look forward to that in the years to come. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much. Rachel, over to you.
Thank you. Well, I normally like to end on a positive note, but I think it's also important to highlight something sobering, which is that in the past 3 decades, the flow of migrants has doubled from the world's most climate vulnerable countries. And climate change is really pushing people out of their homes and increasing the numbers of vulnerable migrants that will fall into unethical recruitment situations and possibly forced labor. So I'm a firm believer that in our 3 Ps framework, prevention, prosecution, and protection of forced labor victims, and including migrants, we need to keep in mind that part of the prevention is addressing climate change through adaptation and climate change mitigation. And if I have one call to action, it's that organizations working in the space of protection of migrant workers work together more closely even than we are already with environmental organizations to integrate that climate change angle into our prevention work. It's a huge challenge coming up for us. Millions more migrants forced out of their homes by climate change, but also we have an opportunity to work even more closely together.
Great. Thank you so much, Rachel. Sharon, the last word is yours.
Yeah, so 2 thoughts, separate but all related. I mean, the first is that I'm really glad that the issue of fair wages was brought into this conversation, because what we see at the Fair Labor Association is that this issue is responsible for so many of the other challenges that workers and migrant workers face. And like SAI, we are working with the Global Wage Coalition and partnered with the anchors to develop a methodology that our companies are now using to actually collect data at the factory level based on the methodology from the Global Living Wage Coalition. And we've created a dashboard so a company can see, based on that data, how their wages for workers in their factories align with the Global Living Wage Coalition standard, with the Asia floor wage, for example, with minimum wage in a particular country. So you can really begin to see and drive a conversation about how the industry can work together to increase wages based on a shared set of data. So it's a new dashboard, and we're actually making it available to non-FLA members. So stay tuned for more on that. But the other, broader thought, again, consistent with what Rachel was saying, is that so many of the issues that drive migrant workers, require really a comprehensive, holistic response. By the time a migrant worker shows up in a factory or on a farm, a lot of the abuses have already taken place. If they may not have a contractor, they've paid their wages, or they've been driven away from their home because of climate change. So, I think especially on these issues, it's really important to have a holistic and collaborative approach so that we're not only looking at what happens, in a farm or on a factory for a migrant worker, but are really cognizant that it's an entire ecosystem that needs to be addressed. And really the only way to do that is through collaborative effort of companies and civil society, government agencies, and recruiters. So it's a big challenge, as I said, and we are really happy to keep rolling up our sleeves and try to tackle it.
Great. Thank you so much, Sharon. Great attitude to end on. So thank you all very much. This was a great discussion about so many important topics. There's no single solution. Coordination is so essential to tackle these huge obstacles, and I'm grateful that we are all collaborating on this together. So thank you to all the panelists, the audience for joining in with us. And depending on where in the world you are, I wish you a good afternoon or a good evening. All right, thank you all very much.